Yeah. If I talk like this, would that be all right?
Oh, that's wonderful.
Like this, yeah?
That's
Okay, no problem.
That mic's actually pretty good.
Yeah, so now I can leave it here. I mean, I don't need to put it any closer.
Yeah, that's
okay,
fine.
that's good.
Just the ID yourself and the organization.
Cees Hamelink, Professor of International Communication and Human Rights at the University of Amsterdam, and very actively involved in the creation of a document which has come to be called the People's Communication Charter. The origins of the Charter are in 1991, when a group of social activists and media students meet in Penang at the invitation of the Third World Network because of a concern of what's happened in the Gulf War. During the Gulf War, of course, the international media have managed a major propaganda campaign, have disinformed millions of people around the world. And much to our amazement, at least, the public at large didn't really seem to protest. They didn't seem to be concerned about all the lies and all the disinformation during the Gulf War. We came together not only because of the Gulf War, but also because of the fact that we realized that all the efforts in the 1970s to build a new international information order had really failed. And that one of the reasons why this had failed was that to a large extent this had just remained a business of national governments, and that it never became a broad-based social movement. A third motive for us to get together in Penang was the fact that the 1980s, in a way, could be called the decade of the social movements. Because during the 80s, many people around the world had come to realize that if you want to have something like human rights, or if you want to have a clean environment, or peace and security, you couldn't leave the responsibility for this just to states and markets. You would have to get involved yourself as ordinary citizens. And one sees in that decade the development of very active social movements around the world that are to some extent quite successful. Now the odd thing is that all these movements in one way or another had to deal with communications, to send out their own messages. They were all in one way or another affected by what the media did, and yet they wouldn't identify themselves as communications movements. So we felt, coming together in 91, that it's odd that people don't protest when they're being lied to at such a massive scale. If there's going to be a new sort of information order, people would have to be involved. And why not have a massive social movement also in the field of communication and culture? So our question was, but how do we raise people's awareness about these issues? Because the odd thing is indeed, that although people live with the media almost 24 hours around the clock, most don't seem to be concerned. And whatever you do, whatever electronic garbage you throw at people, they don't seem to be deterred, they don't seem to be discouraged. As one of us said during the meeting, it's really strange, because if people buy a television set and they take it home and the bloody thing doesn't work, they know precisely what to do. They get very angry, they call the shopkeeper, they call the president, they send a letter to the consumer union, they sue the bastards, they know what to do. Then when the equipment operates, they sit in front of it, and whatever happens, they never complain again. I mean, they get serious brain damage because of most of the programs transmitted to them, and they don't seem to be concerned. So we said this is going to be different. How are we going to handle this? Well, one thing may be we'll organize a major international tribunal, a media event in The Hague at the site of the Peace Palace, and just we get all these bastards who pollute our cultural environment to stand trial. We'll just sue them. Seemed a nice idea at the time. The only problem, of course, was would the bastards come voluntarily? So that then leads to a complex process of consulting with media bosses. And in that process, one of the things I do is indeed have a meeting with one of those people who we really would like to see stand trial, Mr. Ted Turner of CNN. Now this leads in a funny way actually to the beginning of the People's Communication Charter, because in the discussions with CNN it turns out that People like Turner, I mean, we've talked to other media bosses as well, and they all basically said the same. First of all, you need to have a document. Because it's all nice and well for you to say that people, maybe should be worried about the media, but if people are not worried about the media, why would we be worried about this? I mean, people seem to like what they get around the world, so what's your problem? And if people want to eat hamburgers the whole day, so what's your problem? And indeed, I thought in those discussions they had a good point. If millions and millions of people around the world like the programs they get, I mean, if the only thing they would like to do with the rest of their life is just sit and watch the bold and the beautiful, who are we social activists to decide, that we should make them happy against their will? That would be very paternalistic. But we said, no, we at least have a question mark. We're not absolutely certain, We know people like hamburgers, but we're not certain that they'd like to eat them all day. We know people like Disney theme parks, but we're not absolutely certain they'd like to live in a theme park 24 hours around the clock. So let's try to find that out. So the bosses, media bosses say, have a document. Make a statement about what you expect from the media, and get yourself a constituency for the document. And then, now you can call us to be tried in The Hague. Now, so our mission in life then is very clear. Write a document, get a constituency. The document has now been written, and over the past years, in a very interesting process, it's been revised and revised, because the idea from the beginning was that this should not be holy scriptures. This should be an open and dynamic document to which many people could make a contribution, so that many individuals and groups around the world could appropriate the document and feel, it was also their own document, not something imposed on them by an intellectual elite. Now, that's a slow process. And many people say, well, it's now 98. I mean, shouldn't you make some progress on this PCC? I mean, you've been at this for many, many years. My answer to that is always, if you decide it's going to be an open and democratic process, it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, no one ever told us that democracy would be easy. I mean, actually, the dictatorship is much easier. Democracy is, in that sense, a very complicated proposition. You need an awful lot of patience. But I think in the end it's worthwhile, because now one sees around the world that more and more social groups, all kinds of coalitions, individuals, sign up for the PCC and think it's a document they can support. Also because they feel if it doesn't always precisely reflect what you think, you can still help to improve this. And it's flexible also in the sense that people can make use of it in their own situation. Now, what needs to be said is that the PCC is today it's a text. Now with a preamble, which says all the nice things that one ought to say, and then it has 18 articles. And the 18 articles basically say, whatever you do in communications, respect human rights. And then it says, all the resources you need to communicate, such as the airwaves and frequencies, are our common heritage. They can't be privately appropriated. And then it says, communications can't be monopolized, neither by states nor by markets. And then it says, people have a fundamental right to their own identities. And lastly, it says, and those who provide communications and information services need to be held publicly accountable for what they do. Now, this all is rather straightforward, and it's not necessarily revolutionary, it's not necessarily very new. The important thing is that this is not a document by governments. It's not a document of an intergovernmental UN institution. It's a document that's developed by civil movements and that's carried and supported by people themselves as an expression of what they want. Now, in that sense, it's also interesting that the PCC is just not more than a text. It's a source of inspiration, and maybe a text is not going to change the world, I think, but maybe the text could inspire people to make some changes. The implication of this is, of course, something that many people find very difficult to understand. People will forever come to the initiators and will say, but who's the president of the PCC? Where can I sign up for membership? Where can I pay? What's the institutional framework? No, there is no president. There is no board. There is no Politburo. It's just a document, which I think is the strength of the whole movement, because no one has to be worried about little petty power games, because there is no power to be distributed in the movement, since no one is the president. And since, it's not a major institution, we don't have to go out and raise funds. And of course, fundraising is always a cause for many political struggles and antagonisms and infighting. We're not troubled by all of that. It's a document, and people take it upon themselves in their own organization to do something with it. That, I think, on the long run is the strength of it, that with the document, people will begin, as we see happening now around the world, build up coalitions on certain issues and intervene in public policy making on the local level, on the national level, and on the global level. And will be worried about a whole range of communications issues, but they will do it themselves. And if you want, that I think is the great success of the PCC, that people begin to take responsibility for their own communications environment. And they don't have to do this by the letter of the PCC. They may even just throw it away, because that in itself is not important. They don't even have to remember whoever initiated this. I mean, the greatest achievement, I think, is someone calling me up one day from Latin America and saying, listen, there is an interesting document I've just read, and I think you should know about this. So if the document can be totally, be separate from those who have initiated this, from the institutions that have initiated this, and just lives around the world as an inspirational text, that does what I think is crucial. The document, of course, is very strongly inspired by the notion of human rights, and particularly the right to communicate. Now, what is so interesting about the human rights framework is that it doesn't only provide people with entitlements to A, B, and C, but it also says, if you're serious about these rights, you've got to be serious about your own responsibility to implement these rights. I've always believed that the most basic statement about human rights was made immediately after the Second World War by Mahatma Gandhi, when he was asked what he thought about human rights. And then he said, I've always learned from my wise and illiterate mother that rights stem from duties well done. And I think that's the crux, if you want, of the human rights system. It provides rights, and it's unique because it provides, for the first time in human history, rights to all people. All people matter. But it also implies that if all people matter, it means that all people should take responsibility for the implementation of rights. And if we just sit back comfortably and think, well, this is what the government will do, this is what the market will do, we'll be very surprised one day to find out there are no rights left for us. So that's what the PCC says. Communications is so tremendously important, and we become so absolutely dependent upon the quality of information provision to know what goes on in the world. But it's just too important to just leave it to the media, to the professionals, to government. We've got to take responsibility for that ourselves.
Okay. I won't keep you much longer. Let's get my focus again.
There's all kinds of activities that are being organized, inspired by the People's Communication Charter. And one I'd like to mention particularly, there's a group of people that has decided that maybe it's not yet time for an international tribunal, but we can at least begin to organize a series of international hearings. And they have decided that next year, 99, in May, there will be a major international public hearing in The Hague on one of the violations of the People's Communication Charter. And this is linguicide, the forced disappearance of languages around the world. An independent panel of judges will sit in judgment of cases in the world where this happens. And the idea is that this could build up, and that next year there would be, or the following year, 2000, there will be yet another tribunal. So eventually the set of hearings may develop into something like a permanent international tribunal on violations of the People's Communication Charter. So we finally may get at CNN and have them stand trial. Now, what the background to this is of course that however powerful the mainstream media may seem, or however powerful the transnational industrial system may seem, it's got one very weak element, which is people themselves. But the only thing that needs to happen for the whole system to collapse is people simply saying no. And that's the most revolutionary word that people could possibly use. And of course the PCC is part of that educational exercise. But it's more than just people saying no to the dominant media. It's also the feeling that people can have the power to express themselves. So I think in the whole process it would really not be enough if people only said we don't want CNN. But people will also have to begin to build up their own media, find their own fora of expression, and begin to realize that once they have their own community radio, television stations, or whatever media they may find themselves, that will make an enormous difference. Because that's what the whole process is all about, that people begin to realize that they, certainly when they join together, are an enormous force in today's even global political arena, and can make an enormous difference.
I think that's great. So maybe you could just start by telling me, just identifying yourself and what organization you're in.
Okay. My name is Lynn Mathoni Wanyeki. I work with a regional development communications NGO based in Kenya. Basically what we try and do is recognizing that a lot of the decisions that affect the lives of people in Africa are now made at the global level. We started out to track global decision-making processes and policies and negotiations at the international level, to feed that information strategically and in time for to African NGOs and community-based groups, to enable them to organize local level discussion fora and planning processes, to lobby their own governments, but also to collect the concerns to feed back into international negotiations. So the aim is really to set up a two-way flow of information between the global and the very local level. As part of that work, some of the communities that we work with said there's no way they can even begin to impact on international decision-making processes if they have no communications fora at their own level. So we started a communications capacity building program, which is the program that I work on, which really tries to assist communities in setting up, developing their communications capacity. And we work with anything that the communities decide feels works for them. If they want to work in theatre, or if they have a tradition of meeting at wells, or just whatever works, from the traditional sort of media all the way up to newer kinds of media, including information technologies. That's what our work is.
Yeah. That's great. Okay, I'll let you catch your breath.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
It's just easier. I don't want to look in the camera, but your eye is hidden.
Can I ask a quick, while your camera's
Sure.
off, a quick question?
Yeah.
Do you still want to have a discussion at lunch about that stuff, or do we want to just leave it and follow it up some other way in terms of what we might possibly do partnership? Can we get in the Vidyazimate side of these?
I think
It's ridiculous for you and I. Yeah, maybe we'll actually try to get a lunch. I'll tell him that now. I'm going to leave now until lunch. So I'll just meet you over there if you can save me a seat. Whatever. I guess, what time do we think lunch would be? 1 o'clock? 1. I'll come back by 1.
Look at the agenda, add an hour.
Yeah.
It's to add, I left my notes inside. One of the things that you spoke about the other day I thought was interesting was, I mean, there are serious infrastructure problems here in South Africa in terms of how people can build a communication system, and some of the solutions you talked about, solar power, wind-up radios, and just how people have adapted technologies, which I think is really interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
And how that works, and also if you think there's a distinction or a reason that people favor radio television.
One of the projects that I work on is a pilot project for East Africa. We're working with 3 communities, one in Kenya, one in Tanzania and one in Uganda. One of them is a pastoralist group, one's an agricultural group, third one is also an agricultural group. They all have very, very different information needs. One group, the group in Kenya, is mainly concerned about women's reproductive health and rights, and also basic sustainable agriculture in the context of the drylands. The group in Tanzania is concerned about, it's facing very severe land alienation from large-scale commercial farmers, horticultural farmers, as well as from the more traditional wildlife conservation groups that take the approach people is bad for animals. And then the group in Uganda is a very integrated kind of rural development program that looks at all issues: water, electrification, women's rights, health, everything. And they're concerned about creating a sort of learning community where participation is part of the decision making around those development needs throughout the process. They came together and their concern was radio, and they identified radio because in Africa the print press is still, although there's been a sort of explosion of print press since the early 90s and independent press, it still tends to be mostly in English, with circulation and distribution very limited for the newer, smaller alternative papers to urban areas. In terms of local language papers, there are some coming up, but they face much more severe problems of banning, shutdown, because they tend to work more in rural areas. And the funny sort of thing is, it is a lot easier since the 90s to organize in urban areas. It is extremely difficult to get beyond the city to do any kind of organizing that is around communities taking control of whether it's land or water or any kind of resource management. So radio remains then, I think, the most accessible communications access. The three communities decided to work in radio for that reason. But we come from a tradition of state-controlled monopolies, and although most of them in the independence era had the aim of setting up rural, local language sort of feeder stations for the national broadcaster, it was very top-down. It was very from the center, translating whatever was said at the national level down to local communities in their own language. There was very little attempt to articulate what the experiences of local communities were with development, or to enable them to have a voice to feed into the structure. So we deal a lot with questions of regulation. It's much easier in Tanzania and Uganda, where they are. In Tanzania, community broadcasting is recognized in their regulation, although they have no specific support mechanisms in terms of what that would mean to subsidize the sector in some way. And in Uganda, the government is extremely committed as part of their overall decentralization program to seeing community broadcasters set up. And last year at a meeting, they actually committed themselves to enabling 2 community broadcasters a year to get on air. In Kenya, of course, we're still in a really fairly repressive, what I'd call passive repressive environment, where although broadcasting has semi-opened up, it's not been within a framework, and of course the people who are getting licenses are people who are related to, in some way, the party in power, although entering it now from a commercial side. The newer stations are still very urban based, and very much in entertainment. Just basically dealing with American-style music, American-style DJs. So we've put a lot of work in terms of addressing the regulatory framework in Kenya specifically. We have some of that work still to do in Tanzania and Uganda to put into place, like I say, regulation that cross-subsidizes the community broadcast sector. In Kenya, it really is a question of making access open. So that's one approach that we've taken in terms of dealing with the media environment. The other thing that's come up is there's been a huge push from the sort of IMF and World Bank to open up telecoms. And I think one of the things that we've not paid enough to as media workers is the impact that telecommunications has on broadcasters. One of the things we lobbied for in Kenya was an independent regulator for broadcasting, and we actually won. The government commission that was looking into taking submissions from people and what they wanted the broadcasting framework to be agreed to that, but was totally overrun by what came out from the Telecoms Commission. Basically, there is going to be one commission or one regulator that regulates telecoms and broadcasting, and we were putting all our energy into the commission